He is a philosophy of religion, philosophy of mind, and applied philosophy. And interestingly, he has also a background in applied mathematics. He is the author of several important books on these in exploring topics in these three research areas. And it also is the editor of Religious Studies, which is one of probably the top academic journal in the field, among others. Today, Professor Nagasawa will share on one of the research topics is most interested in, that is the problem of the evil. Professor Nagasawa, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for hosting this talk. Right. So currently, I run a project called the Global Philosophy of Religion Project at the University of Birmingham. The aim of this project is to globalize and diversify the philosophy of religion, because the focus of this field has been quite narrow. So we want to shed the light on underrepresented religious traditions, and then also philosophers in underrepresented countries. And Victoria is an advisory board member, and she has been very, very helpful in developing a global network of philosophers of religion. And as part of this project, we work with Closer to Truth, which is an American TV documentary series. And they interview many philosophers from all over the world to discuss some fundamental philosophical questions from diverse religious perspectives. And you can see a photo of Victoria here because she was interviewed for this program as well. So if you go to the website of Closer to Truth, closertotruth.com, you can find many interesting interviews. And we are also creating TV episodes based on global philosophy of religion. And we have also supported many philosophers around the world. So we spent nearly $500,000 to fund research activities of scholars in more than 25 countries, especially in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. And also we have organized many conferences, seminars, public lectures, and also we have produced open access publications. So if you are interested, please take a look at our website, which is global-philosophy.org. Okay, so today's talk is part of this project, just as my small part of this big global project. So I have been interested in the problem of evil for a long time. I have written many papers and book chapters on this topic. And I'm really interested in approaching the problem of evil from a global, diverse perspective. So here's a quote from J.L. Mackey's influential paper called Evil and Omnipotence, which was published in 1955. So here's a quote from Mackey. The problem of evil, in the sense in which I shall be using the phrase, is a problem only for someone who believes that there is a God who is both omnipotent and wholly good. So what Mackey says here is that the problem of evil, or at least a version of the problem of evil that he defends here, is a problem specifically for traditional theists who believe that there is an omnipotent and wholly good God. And in another place, he says that if you are willing to give up God's omnipotence or goodness, then the problem of evil doesn't arise for you. But I want to know if that's really true. And I want to argue that there are actually different versions of the problem of evil that pose challenges for not just for traditional theists, but also for non-theists. So I'm currently working on a book titled The Problem of Evil for Non-Theists. And by non-theists, I mean pantheists, panentheists, axiarchists, and atheists. So I argue in this book that there are distinct versions of the problem of evil for not just for traditional theists, but also for non-theists. And I also argue in the book that traditional theists are better positioned to respond to the problem than non-theists, because theists, as supernaturalists, have a lot of resources to address the problem of evil. So if another thing that I say is that if non-theists can develop a successful response to the problem, then traditional theists can adopt it as well. Because if non-theists can develop a naturalistic response to the problem of evil that would solve the problem, then traditional theists can just borrow it because they are supernaturalists, and supernaturalist ontology is more comprehensive than naturalist ontology. But in this talk, I want to address a slightly different topic. So I want to figure out if there is a version of the problem of evil even for Eastern philosophers or followers of Eastern religious or cultural traditions. So in this presentation, I focus on Hojoki, which is a medieval Japanese text written by Hamono Chome. And I address the relationship between Chome's idea and the problem of evil. And I argue that he presents a version of the problem of evil, which I call the problem of impermanence in his text. And then I address 4 responses to the problem of impermanence found in medieval Japanese texts, and then assess them. And then I argue that the only response that is potentially successful is the 4th response, transcendentalism. And I conclude that this means that the problem of impermanence, which is a version of the problem of evil found in medieval Japanese philosophy, is an indirect argument for transcendentalism or supernaturalism. And then I will conclude. So let me start with Hojoki and the problem of evil. So Hojoki was written by Hamono Chome, who was a son of a Shinto priest and who became a lay Buddhist monk in his towards the end of his life. And it was written in 1212. And in this book, he describes many disasters and catastrophes that people in Kyoto experienced within a 9-year period. Kyoto was the capital of Japan at that time. And this text is considered one of the most important literary works in the Kamakura period. So let me introduce some of the disasters that he describes in Hojoki. The first disaster that Chome describes is a great fire in 1177. So he says, "For those caught up in the blaze, it must have seemed a nightmare. Some fell, choked with smoke, others were blinded by the flames and quickly perished." So there was a very crowded area of Kyoto where there were many houses and there was a fire, and so many houses were destroyed and so many people were killed. All human undertaking is folly, but it is most particularly futile to spend your wealth and trouble your peace of mind by building a house in the perilous capital. So what he seems to be saying here is that, okay, maybe the fire took place naturally, but humans are partly responsible because they build so many houses in a small area. And that's why the damage was really devastating. And in a Western framework, we can understand this as an example of natural evil amplified by moral evil. So sometimes natural evil and moral evil are intertwined. One of them can amplify the other. Here is the second disaster that he describes. He introduces 4 disasters, and this is the second one, which is a series of whirlwinds in 1180. Whirlwinds are quite common, but do they ever blow like this? This was no ordinary wind, and all wondered whether it was not some portent from on high. Mono no satoshi. Mono no satoshi basically means some kind of warning of invisible spirits. So because these winds were so strong and killed so many people that they wondered if there is some kind of sign from a supernatural being. Chome also writes, the karmic wind of hell, jigoku no go no kaze, itself would be such as this, it seemed. The karmic wind of hell is a very hot and strong wind that is believed to blow in hell in response to human wrongdoing. So from a Western perspective, this can be understood as an example where a certain instance of evil is caused by a supernatural being or supernatural entity. The third disaster that Chome describes is a series of famines in 1180 to 1182. He writes, disaster followed on disaster, and all the crops failed. In vain did people till the fields in spring and plant in summer. Autumn and winter brought no bustling harvest, no storing up of food. Some, as a last resort, were going to run down all the temples, stealing the Buddhist images, dismantling the decorative woodwork in the worship hall, and breaking these up to sell. So people starved so much that some people just went to all the temples and stole some woodwork to sell so that they can buy food. So this is an example where natural evil entailed moral evil. So famines are instances of natural evil, but because of the occurrence of natural evil, people committed moral evil. Chome also describes interesting situations. So he writes, where a man could not bear to part from his wife, or a woman loved her husband dearly, it was always the one whose love was the deeper who died first. In their sympathy for the other, they would put themselves second and give their partner any rare morsel that came their way. So Western philosophers often talk about greater goods realized through negative states of affairs. So, there are some horrific situations where we can observe certain virtues like altruism, love, and compassion. And this is an example of that. The final disaster that Chome describes is a series of earthquakes in 1185. He writes, among all the terrors, I realized then the most terrifying is an earthquake. I saw with sympathy and sadness the parents who held the body of the child in their arms crying out loud. So there was a little child playing near a heavy wall, and there was an earthquake and the wall collapsed and the child was killed. He writes, it was sad to see that the loss of a child was so unbearable that even a brave samurai could not hide his agony. So the little child was a son of samurai, and even this brave samurai and his wife cried because of this loss of a child. And we can understand this as an example of horrendous evil. This is Marilyn Adams's term. So Adams talks about this intense, horrific instance of evil, which make you wonder if the life of the victim is worth living. So looking at these descriptions of horrific events taking place in Kyoto, it looks like Chome is basically addressing the problem of evil, because all the key philosophical concepts in the Western literature on the problem of evil can be found in the text. So Chome talks about the distinction between natural evil and moral evil. He also talks about the case where natural evil is caused by a supernatural, apparently natural evil is caused by a supernatural being. He also talks about the case where natural evil entails moral evil. He also talks about greater goods realized through evil. And also he addresses horrendous evil. But I argue that it is a mistake to think that Chome's focus is on the problem of evil in the Western sense. And my claim here is that Chome's focuses on impermanence rather than pain and suffering. And this is based on the Buddhist notion of Buddhist teaching of the three marks of existence. So according to Buddhism, there are three marks of existence: suffering, impermanence, and non-self. And I argue that the Western problem of evil focuses mainly on suffering, pain and suffering, while what Chome addresses here is the problem of impermanence rather than pain and suffering. So here I say that there are two distinct versions: the problem of pain and suffering, which is mainly discussed in the West, and the problem of impermanence, which is discussed in the East. So here is Chome's view of reality. He presents a very dynamic view of reality. So Chome writes, "On flows the river ceaselessly, nor does its water ever stay the same. The bubbles that float upon its pools now disappear, now form anew, but never endure long. And so it is with people in this world and with their dwellings. Death in the morning, at evening another birth. This is the way of things, no different from the bubbles on the stream." So this is almost like Heraclitus, who said that you cannot step into the same river twice. So we are all like bubbles in the water. We appear and disappear all the time. Everything is impermanent and everything is ephemeral. So that's Chome's view of reality based on Buddhism. Here's another similar view presented by Yoshida Kenko, who wrote Essays in Idleness. Kenko writes, "This world is changeable as the deeps and shallows of Asuka River. Time passes, what was here is gone. Joy and grief visit by turns. Once splendid places change to abandoned wastelands, and even the same house as of old is now home to different people. Still more moving in its transience is the ruin of some fine residence of former times, whose glory we never saw." Pain and suffering are apt illustrations of impermanence, but they are not essential ingredients. So Chome talks about all kinds of disasters and people's pain and suffering in Kyoto, and they are good illustrations or highlighters of the fact that everything is impermanent in reality. But you don't necessarily need to talk about pain and suffering to emphasize the impermanence of everything. The problem of impermanence can also be presented by referring to pleasure and joy. So Yoshida Kenko writes, "Time passes, what was here is gone. Joy and grief visit by turns. Once splendid places change to abandoned wastelands." So we can talk about the impermanence by referring to people's success and glory, or joy and pleasure. Even they can be highlighters of impermanence. Here's another text from the same period. It's called "The Tale of the Heike," which is a war epic. And it reads, "The great man's certain fall, whose life is like a dream one night in spring, and the bold and brave who perish in the end." So even if you are a successful politician and you achieve a lot of things, ultimately, life is impermanent and your glory will not last forever. Here is a poetry by Ariwara no Narihira. So the Japanese are, as you probably know, really obsessed with cherry blossoms. So around this time of the year on TV, everyone talks about cherry blossoms, and even there is a cherry blossom forecasting. So they'll tell you exactly when you can see full blooming of cherry blossoms in specific places. And I think the Japanese love cherry blossoms, not just because they are beautiful, but also because they represent life. So these beautiful flowers, they don't last forever. You can see them only in a short period of time, maybe 1 or 2 weeks. And they tend to think that this really represents life. So here's a poetry related to that by Narihira. If this world had never known the ephemeral charms of cherry blossoms, then our hearts in spring might match nature's deep tranquility. So this is an English translation, so it's not as poetic as the original one. But what he says is that he's being a little bit ironic. So he says that the cherry blossoms are so beautiful that in some way he wishes that they had never existed, because if they had never existed, he wouldn't have to worry in spring when they will disappear. They're so beautiful that he has to worry when he won't be able to see them. So again, here he's talking about something beautiful, but he uses it as a reminder that everything is impermanent. So you don't necessarily need to talk about pain and suffering to illustrate the impermanence of reality. So we can recognize the impermanence through positive events, not just negative events. We can appreciate the impermanence by observing the end of pleasure and joy. Pain and suffering are not essential. That's why I distinguish the problem of pain and suffering and the problem of impermanence. The focus of Chome, Kenko, and other scholars is on impermanence rather than pain and suffering themselves. So now I like to address 4 responses to the problem of impermanence. So we live in this impermanent reality and how we can respond or understand or cope with it. And I will introduce 4 responses: hermetism, hedonism, indifferentism, and transcendentalism. Obviously, these medieval Japanese thinkers, they are not analytic philosophers, so they don't explicitly and systematically present their views. So my job as an analytic philosopher is to read those texts and extract these philosophical ideas and classify them in a clear and systematic way. So let me introduce the first response, hermetism. Hermetism says that we should live a simple life as a hermit and stay away from any potential disasters and catastrophes that we may encounter in civilization. So Chome, the author of Hojoki, himself became a hermit. He thought that the best way to avoid disasters and catastrophes is to stay away from civilization. So towards the end of his life, he lived as a hermit. Here's a quote from Chome. The key to enduring our impermanent and ephemeral existence is to place ourselves in the right environment in which we can stay calm and free ourselves from unnecessary concerns and worries. This world is a hard place to live, and both we and our dwellings are fragile and impermanent, as these events reveal. If you live in a cramped city area, you cannot escape disaster when a fire springs up nearby. So his hermetism is based on Buddhism, which says that we should relinquish all worldly attachments and pursue equanimity. So we suffer because we have attachments to all kinds of worldly things. Equanimity is a perfectly balanced mental state that is free from emotional disturbances and should be cultivated towards nirvana. Hermetism is a lifestyle, not a mere theoretical solution to the problem of impermanence. This is an interesting feature of these Eastern responses to the problem of impermanence. So typically, Western responses to the problem of evil are purely theoretical or theological. So they try to show conceptually, how God and evil can coexist. But Hermetism here is a practical solution, offering a lifestyle, not just a theoretical or abstract solution to the problem. Here's another quote from Chome. The hermit crab prefers a little shell for his home. He knows what the world holds. The osprey chooses the wild shoreline, and this is because he fears mankind. And I too am the same. Knowing what the world holds and its ways, I desire nothing from it, nor chase after its prizes. My one craving is to be at peace, my one pleasure to live free of troubles. So this picture is a replica of Chome's house. So towards the end of his life, he lived a little hut like this, in the mountains, and he lived in isolation. You can find this hut in Kyoto today. There's nothing finer to be alone with nothing to distract you. So this is a quote from Kenko. If you follow the ways of the world, your heart will be drawn to its sensual defilements and easily led astray. Even if you do not yet understand the true way, you can achieve what could be termed temporary happiness, at least by removing yourself from outside influences, taking no part in the affairs of the world, calming yourself and stilling the mind. So Kenko, the author of Essays in Idleness, he also became a hermit in response to impermanence. Okay, so that was hermetism. I will assess each response a little bit later. So let me move on to the second response to the problem of impermanence, which is hedonism. Hedonism also offers practical advice, but its advice contrasts sharply with that of hermetism. Hedonism says that we should pursue hedonistic pleasure and enjoy our impermanent existence as much as possible. So hedonists say that we cannot live forever, everything is impermanent, so we should just enjoy ourselves while we exist. So this is waka poetry by Otomo no Tabito. He wrote a series of 13 poems in praise of sake. Sake is, of course, Japanese rice wine. So he writes, all living things die in the end. So long as I live here, I want a cup of pleasure. By the cup of pleasure, he means a cup of sake. So what he says is that everyone, all humans, all animals die eventually. So there is no point in trying to worry about impermanence or our existence or our fate. We should just enjoy ourselves as long as we are alive. Here's another poem by Tabito. Far better, it seems, than uttering pompous words and looking wise, to drink sake and weep drunken tears. So what's interesting is that he's expressing anti-intellectualism here. So he's ridiculing hermits, because hermits tend to be snobby intellectuals. So they philosophize impermanence, and they live in isolation, and they build a hut in the mountains, and they read a poem and sing a song. And Tabito is ridiculing them here, saying that that's not a clever way to respond to impermanence. And he says that we can just use alcohol to enjoy ourselves. And this is a down-to-earth response to impermanence, which is available for anyone. And it's interesting that they use alcoholic drinks, because those medieval philosophers in Japan, they often say that life is like a dream, or reality is like a dream. It's a very elusive, impermanent, and ephemeral. And when we get drunk, we feel like everything is dizzy and not very clear. So in a way, we can consider hermetism as an attempt to go deeper into dreams. So if reality is dreamlike, we should just go deeper into this dream. That's the idea of hedonism. Here, Tabito is not entirely content with hedonism. So just going back, because he talks about weep drunken tears. So on the one hand, he says that we can just drink alcoholic drinks to enjoy ourselves, but on the other hand, he kind of implies that there is sad reality that their enjoyment will not last forever. By drinking, Tabito cannot overcome the sad reality that everything comes to an end. The more fun he has, the more vividly he realizes that his enjoyment will not last forever. Okay, so here's the third response to the problem of impermanence, which I call indifferentism. Indifferentism says that we should simply accept the impermanence of reality because there is no point in trying to overcome it. We have no control over it because we ourselves are fundamentally impermanent. So indifferentism says that we cannot do anything. Life is intrinsically impermanent, so we cannot overcome impermanence. So we should just accept impermanence and just live life. So in this sense, we can say that this is a no response. So the best response to impermanence is to say to not to do anything, just accept impermanence and live life. Here's a quote from Yoshida Kenko, the author of Essays in Idleness. Life is like the game of Mamakodate. I think Mamakodate is like a game like Othello. Soldiers going into battle, aware of the closeness of death, forget their home and their own safety. And it is sheer folly for a man who lives secluded from the world in his lowly hut, spending his days in idle delight in his garden, to pass off such matters as irrelevant to himself. Do you imagine that the enemy impermanence will not come forcing its way into your peaceful mountain retreat? The recluse faces death as surely as the soldier setting forth to battle. So Kenko was a hermit, but also he was self-critical. I think this is another interesting feature of these Eastern thinkers. So they pursue a certain response to impermanence, but at the same time, they're sometimes self-critical. So here, Kenko is criticizing hermits like himself, because hermits, they live in isolation and they pretend that they can avoid impermanence, but actually they cannot. No one can avoid impermanence. And looking at, look at soldiers. They don't try to avoid impermanence. They face impermanence and they accept that everything is impermanent and they might die at any moment. And Kenko says that maybe their reaction to impermanence is more sincere. So life is like a game which is guaranteed to end in our loss, death, even though we do not know when that will happen. Scholars, like hermits, intellectualize impermanence and willingly live as hermits as if they can escape it. Soldiers who realize that their own death can happen at any moment know better than intellectuals, according to indifferentism. Here's a poem by Saigyo, who was also a hermit. He's also self-critical. So he reads, "And vow renouncement of the world, but cannot let it go. Some who have never taken vows do cast the world away." So what he says here is that he decided to live as a hermit. So he made a radical decision, but sometimes he wonders if that's the right decision, because the very fact that he makes such a radical decision to live as a hermit may suggest that he's so attached to the world. And ordinary people like farmers or merchants, they just live their lives. And maybe they're better at reacting to impermanence. They don't even try to solve the problem of impermanence. They just accept impermanence. Okay, so here's the fourth and final response that I want to introduce. And after this, I will assess these four responses. So the fourth response is transcendentalism. Transcendentalism says that we can overcome impermanence by transcending our impermanent existence. We can say that this is an approach to try to go beyond dreams. So, as I mentioned, many Japanese thinkers think that the world is dreamlike, life is dreamlike, everything feels transient and ephemeral. And if that's true, then maybe we should try to go beyond this impermanent reality. Maybe there's something beyond our current reality. So our goal is to wake up from an elusive, dreamlike, impermanent reality into a new transcendental reality. So this is the Iroha song, which is basically an old Japanese alphabet song based on Buddhist text. It goes like this: Although its scent still lingers on, the form of a flower has scattered away. For whom will the glory of this world remain unchanged? Arriving today at the yonder side of deep mountains of ever-sent existence, we shall never allow ourselves to drift away intoxicated in the world of shallow dreams. So what this poem says is that we should recognize our impermanent existence in the changing world by looking at blossoming flowers, which, despite their beauty, will inevitably scatter in the end. And we should avoid absorbing ourselves into the dreamlike, elusive reality and overcome impermanence by crossing the deep mountains of karma. So there is something beyond these deep mountains. Maybe there is something permanent, or we can transcend this impermanent reality by going beyond these deep mountains. Here's a poem by Saigyo, who was again a hermit. All in the world is a dream I see, and seeing its transience, yet still my heart does not awake. So what Saigyo says here is that he wants to wake up into a new reality. But he just cannot, because he's so attached to the world. He cannot get rid of all worldly attachments that he has. So even though he wants to wake up into a new reality, he just cannot. Now I'd like to assess those 4 responses to the problem of impermanence. And in order to assess these responses, I think it's helpful to understand that the problem of impermanence and the problem of pain and suffering, which is discussed in the West, are versions of the problem of expectation mismatch. So this is my terminology. So here's the idea. So the problem of pain and suffering, which is discussed in the West, are concerned with the apparent incompatibility between the existence of evil or existence of pain and suffering on the one hand, and the existence of God. So theists believe that God is all-powerful and all-loving, so their expectation is pretty high. So if God is the creator of the world, the natural expectation is that the world is really, really amazing, because God is all-powerful, he can do anything, God is all-loving, so he's most compassionate. So God would create an amazingly good world. But if we look at the reality, the world contains all sorts of horrible events like wars and crimes and natural disasters. So there is a gap between expectation and reality. And I think that that's the source of the problem of pain and suffering. And we have a similar structure here for the problem of impermanence. So we typically, naturally assume that everything will go on forever. But the problem of impermanence suggests that actually everything is impermanent. Nothing lasts forever. Even if you have pleasure and joy, they will never last forever. Life will never last forever. So there is a gap between our expectation and reality. So the problem is how we can fill this gap. So there is the problem of expectation mismatch, and the problem of evil is one of them. There are many other versions of the problem of expectation mismatch. And there are 2 versions of the problem of evil, which are the problem of pain and suffering and the problem of impermanence. Again, the mismatch in question corresponds to a gap between our expectation and reality. Here, I will argue that only transcendentalism can offer a potentially successful response, which means that the problem of impermanence poses a greater challenge to naturalism than supernaturalism, because transcendentalism requires supernaturalism. And this also means that the problem of impermanence can be considered a partial argument for supernaturalism and against naturalism. So what I will argue is that the first 3 responses, hermetism, hedonism, and indifferentism, they are unsuccessful. And then I say transcendentalism is the only response that is potentially successful. I will not say that it is successful, but it is potentially successful. And because transcendentalism requires supernaturalism, this means that if you think that there is a successful response to the problem of impermanence, then you have to accept supernaturalism. Okay, so let me assess the first response, Hermetism, first. Hermetism can be understood as an attempt to close the gap between our expectation and reality by minimizing negativity in reality. So in this sense, we can consider it as a defensive response. So Hermetism says that despite impermanence, we can still be content with life if we avoid the negative consequence of human wrongdoings and natural disasters by living in isolation. So hermits try to fill the gap between expectation and reality by avoiding potential disasters and catastrophes. And here are some quick objections to Hermetism. First, while hermits may be successful in avoiding certain types of pain and suffering, they may also inadvertently promote other types of pain and suffering. So hermits claim that if we live in isolation, we can avoid many disasters, we can eliminate pain and suffering. But by living as a hermit, they might actually promote other types of pain and suffering. They may also inadvertently relinquish certain types of pleasure and joy that can be experienced only by living in civilization. So it's not very clear if they can really, hermits can really fill the gap between expectation and reality. Another objection that I want to propose is that hermits cannot escape negativity entirely by living in isolation because birth, aging, illness, and dying are rooted in human nature. So if Buddhism is right, then we cannot avoid these features of human nature. So we cannot completely avoid impermanence, even if we pursue Hermetism. And most importantly, Hermetism is at the best a response to the problem of pain and suffering, not the problem of impermanence. Impermanence may be less visible to hermits because pain and suffering are highlighters of impermanence, yet we cannot escape impermanence itself. So I made a distinction between the problem of pain and suffering discussed in the West and the problem of impermanence discussed in the East. And they are distinct problems. So by living as a hermit, you might be able to avoid a lot of disasters, which means that you can avoid a lot of pain and suffering. So that might address the problem of pain and suffering, but that doesn't address the problem of impermanence, because for the problem of impermanence, pain and suffering are only highlighters of impermanence, not impermanence itself. So Hermetism seems to conflate the highlighters of impermanence with impermanence itself. Now, I would like to assess hedonism, the second response. Hedonism is an attempt to close the gap by maximizing positivity in reality instead of minimizing negativity in reality. So this is an offensive response. So hedonists try to promote pleasure and happiness by drinking alcoholic drinks, and that's how they try to fill the gap between expectation and reality. Despite the impermanence, we can still be content with life if we enjoy ourselves as much as possible, according to hedonists. And here are some objections. First, hedonists may be successful in promoting hedonistic pleasure and joy, but they may also inadvertently relinquish certain types of pleasure and joy. Also, they may inadvertently promote types of pain and suffering that arise only in hedonistic life. By living as hedonists, you may be addicted to alcoholic drinks, and that might harm your health. So it's not clear that you can really fill the gap between expectation and reality by living as hedonists. Also, hedonists cannot escape negativity by living hedonistically because, again, according to Buddhism, pain and suffering arise from birth, aging, illness, and dying, which are rooted in our human nature. And thirdly, and most importantly, hedonists' attempt to promote pleasure and joy can backfire because pleasure and joy, as much as pain and suffering, can be highlighters of impermanence. So I have argued that impermanence can be highlighted by referring to not just pain and suffering, but also pleasure and joy. So by having a lot of fun, you might realize more vividly that everything is impermanent. So it's not very clear how hedonists can avoid impermanence. So here's my assessment of the third response, indifferentism. Indifferentism says that we shouldn't do anything but simply live ordinary lives as ordinary people. So we should accept reality as it is. There is no point in attempting to decrease negativity or increase positivity. That's why I said that this is a no response to the problem of impermanence. Unlike Hermetism and hedonism, indifferentism addresses the problem of impermanence directly. I think indifferentism is a consistent response, which is obvious because it basically suggests that we should just accept impermanence. We cannot do anything. So there is nothing contradictory about it. But I just want to point out the little paradox that the indifferentism seems to face. There cannot be genuine indifferentism as a response to the problem of impermanence. Once we recognize impermanence as a philosophical problem, we cannot just live ordinary lives as ordinary people. So let's say, as a philosopher, I assess the problem of impermanence and I decide that indifferentism is the best response. So from tomorrow, I will live as a farmer or a merchant. I want to live as an ordinary person. But you might think that this is not really authentic, because it's not that I live as a farmer or a merchant and accept impermanence as it is. It is instead I'm just living as a farmer or merchant as a philosophical response to the problem of impermanence. So there is something unauthentic about my response to the problem of impermanence as an indifferentist here. But I don't say that this is a devastating problem for indifferentism, because I think that the indifferentism is a consistent response. So indifferentism is a coherent, if not attractive, response to the problem of impermanence. If we accept it accepts impermanence as it is and simply swallows it. It is comparable to pessimism about reality and life. So pessimists just accepts the pessimistic view of reality and life, and they don't try to avoid it or try to overcome it. So in that sense, this is a coherent or consistent view, even though it might not be attractive for many people. So in that sense, indifferentism is not a satisfying solution to the problem of impermanence. It doesn't solve the problem. Okay, so this is the final one. So I want to assess transcendentalism. Transcendentalism says that we can overcome impermanence by waking up into a new reality. And I think there are two different ways of presenting transcendentalism in the Eastern framework. So I want to introduce what I call ineffable transcendentalism, which is based on Buddhism, and permanent transcendentalism, which is based on Hinduism. Ineffable transcendentalism is again based on Buddhism, and this is based on the idea that everything is impermanent. So if Buddhism is right, everything is impermanent. If there are gods and angels and heaven and hell, they are all impermanent as well. It's not just that the material universe is impermanent and there's some kind of permanent reality beyond that. Buddhism says that we should overcome impermanence by transcending impermanence rather than denying impermanence or stipulating permanence, because there's no such thing as permanence in Buddhism. Buddhism places us in samsara, the continuous cycle of death and rebirth, and encourages us to escape from the cycle. There is no true self or permanent soul transmigrating in this metaphysical system. Our ultimate soteriological goal is nirvana, an ineffable and indescribable state of enlightenment, which represents an escape from the cycle. Nirvana is analogous to blowing out the flame, meaning ending the cycle of rebirth and death, a long process which involves states of being that are conditioned, impermanent, and unsatisfactory. And no language or concept can fully capture such a state because it is unthinkable or incomprehensible by logical reason. In Japanese, we say fukashigi. We should achieve the state of a non-self, a state of release from suffering and impermanence, instead of trying to find the permanent self. Because in Buddhism, there is no such thing as the permanent self. Ineffable transcendentalism is a supernaturalist view. So it seems that we can transcend the impermanent reality, even though there is no such thing as permanence. We exist in an impermanent realm of conditioned existence, but this realm does not exhaust all of reality. Okay, so that was ineffable transcendentalism. And now I want to introduce another version of transcendentalism, which I call permanent transcendentalism. And this version is based on Hinduism. According to this view, impermanence applies only to the reality in which we currently live, and there is another permanent reality beyond that. And we exist in an impermanent realm of conditioned existence, but this realm does not exhaust all of reality. That's why this is also a form of supernaturalism. The Atman is the permanent, unchanging self that exists beyond phenomenality and external conditions. The Hindu belief in the Atman directly opposes the Buddhist doctrine of non-self. So this is probably the most significant point where Hinduism and Buddhism disagree. So Hinduism postulates the permanent self here. Here's a quote from the Chandogya Upanishad. The Atman is free from sin, free from old age, free from death, free from sorrow. It is immortal and fearless. So there is something immortal or permanent here. The Atman is an eternal, indestructible self that exists beyond the ego. We are part of samsara, and the jiva, the individual self, transmigrates into the body of another living being after death. If we take the right path, we will eventually achieve moksha, the blissful end of cycle of death and rebirth, where we are finally freed from suffering. So that's a Hindu version of permanent transcendentalism. So there is some kind of permanent reality beyond our current impermanent reality. But transcendentalism can be formulated in the Western framework as well. So in the Judeo-Christian tradition, there are a lot of permanent entities. So traditional theists talk about the necessary existence of God or the eternal soul and so on. So there is something beyond the material universe in the Judeo-Christian framework. But I'm not defending any version of transcendentalism here. I'm not saying that transcendentalism is correct. All I'm saying is that only transcendentalism can offer a satisfactory response to the problem of impermanence. So any version of another point that I want to make is that any version of transcendentalism requires supernaturalism beyond impermanence. That's why I say transcendentalism is available only for supernaturalists. Any satisfactory solution to the problem of impermanence requires supernaturalism. The problem of impermanence poses a greater challenge to naturalists, or at least to naturalists who reject indifferentism, than to supernaturalists. So if you are a naturalist, you would really struggle to respond to the problem of impermanence, because in the naturalistic framework, there is nothing beyond the nature or beyond the material spatio-temporal universe in which we currently exist. If we believe that there is an ultimate and optimistic solution to the problem of impermanence, we have no choice but to accept supernaturalism. So here, again, I'm not saying that supernaturalism is true. All I'm saying is that, if we think that there is a successful solution to the problem of impermanence, then we have to rely on supernaturalism. So if supernaturalism is false, probably we don't have any satisfactory response to the problem of impermanence. Okay, so here's the conclusion. So I have introduced Kamono Chome's work, Hojoki. And I argue that on the face of it, Hojoki is work on the problem of evil, because Chome addresses many philosophical concepts concerning evil, which are discussed in the Western literature. But I argue that actually Chome's main focus is not on the problem of evil in the Western sense. So it's not about the problem of pain and suffering. Chome's focus is more on the problem of impermanence, and he only uses pain and suffering as highlighters of impermanence. Pain and suffering, and even pleasure and joy, are highlighters of how fragile and impermanent our existence is. And then I introduce 4 responses to the problem of impermanence, which I can find in the Japanese literature. So hermetism, hedonism, indifferentism, and transcendentalism. And I have argued that only transcendentalism has the potential to offer an ultimate solution to the problem. And this means that the problem of impermanence raises a greater challenge to naturalists than supernaturalists. I think this is an interesting conclusion, because normally the problem of evil is considered a problem for traditional theists or supernaturalists. And it's an argument for atheism or naturalism. But I'm saying that it's almost the other way around. So the problem of impermanence seems to raise a greater challenge for naturalists than supernaturalists. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That was a very fascinating talk.
Yeah.
And let's open now the discussion. Okay, we have John here.
Thank you, Professor Nagasawa, for this very inspirational and comprehensive talk. And at the beginning of your talk, I'm inspired by you mentioning that for the permanence, it also has a side of kind of positive side, like it can be also joyful. And since if it is impermanent, like so the COVID will be over. So, and also it has this positive side. So I'm thinking of whether thinking of the impermanence itself has this nature of positive side. Can we also use this side as a response to the problem of evil in the sense of impermanence? Because in itself, it already has, it's not always in the strong negative things, it already has these positive things in itself. Like would we also considering thinking of responding to impermanence as a way of befriending impermanence, and so also a kind of positive way of actively engaging, looking for the conditions that leading to joyful or to happy conditioning, rather, and avoiding the suffering and the pain, which would be a sign of evil. And so how do you think of this? Can be a potential also?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. So you might think that actually impermanence is not necessarily a bad thing. It can be a positive thing, because, for instance, if you have to suffer a lot, maybe ending your existence might be a good thing. So there's a literature on the desirability of immortality, and some philosophers argue that actually immortality is not always good. Actually, mortality is good, because if life goes on forever, I mean, there's Bernard Williams's argument saying that we'll be eventually bored. So life is meaningful, or life is good precisely because it's impermanent. If it goes on forever, it becomes pointless. And also there is in the Japanese aesthetics, there is this idea that impermanence is actually beautiful. So if these cherry blossoms, if they last forever permanently every day, then it's not as beautiful as they currently are. So there's the impermanence can be actually something positive or beautiful. So it's not always negative. And I think that kind of idea is related to the point that you made.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you kindly for your presentation. This was really quite a joy. I'm reminded of sort of maybe other, maybe more Western responses to not necessarily impermanence, but the kind of absurdity of the suffering in life as well, and that kind of dreamlike state that kept coming up in these lovely Japanese poems. And that reminded me very much of the tradition of sort of Gnosticism, as well as the American novel Moby Dick, and the whole idea of trying to escape from our reality, and that being perhaps a kind of self-defeating pursuit. But we won't know if we don't try.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. So is this the idea? So we want to escape impermanence, but there's something a little bit paradoxical about it, because we are impermanent by nature. So by trying to escape impermanence, we almost become something other than ourselves. Is that?
Yes, I think that's just it.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, there are a lot of paradoxical consequences of avoiding impermanence, because if you accept this Buddhist belief that we are fundamentally impermanent, then trying to avoid or even transcend impermanence might be considered an attempt to undermine our own nature, and maybe it's as contradictory or impossible. Yeah, so that's very interesting. Thank you.
Thanks again.
Can I ask a question?
Ellen, we have
Okay.
one question here. Pakriti has one question, and then Ellen, you can ask your question, okay? Just one question here. She's ready.
Thank you, Professor, for such a beautiful talk. But I have one clarification to make about hermits. I mean, hermits can also, because they're going away from the reality and they're staying away. I'm sorry if I have missed that point, but isn't that almost like they're not trying to avoid the negativity of the situation, but they're also posing the thought that if I stay away from the society, then I don't get any expectations, because if I'm a social being, I'm living with other people, then I'm also having all these expectations from the society. So if I move away, I don't have the society expectations, and that does not give the birth to the difference that I'm looking at.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and I agree with you. So one of the problems with hermetism is that, okay, by living in isolation, they might avoid horrible events, but at the same time, they have to get rid of other good things. So hermits are no longer people living in the society, so they cannot enjoy a lot of positive things that they can have, by living as social beings. So that's one of the problems for hermits. I wrote a popular article about hermetism versus hedonism, and in that article I said that this is kind of analogous to our reaction to the global pandemic. So some people decided to live in isolation, all of us self-isolated, so we are like hermits for for a certain period of time, while other people, some younger people, they said that, you know, we cannot do this forever, and they try to have a lot of parties and they try to enjoy ourselves. And, you know, many people said something very similar to hedonists. So they said that, you know, we will die sooner or later, so we cannot live in isolation forever, just enjoy ourselves. And we thought that I thought that was kind of analogous to Hermetism and hedonism. But the problem of Hermetism is, as you said, you know, by living in isolation, they will lose a lot of positive things that they can have by living in the human community.
Ellen? Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Professor Nagasawa, for your talk. I have two questions. My first question is a follow-up of the question given by the first person who raised the question, dealing with also your interpretation of impermanence here. I can see your point to try to look at this notion of impermanence and in the context of the problem of evil. But from a Buddhist perspective, to link impermanence with problem of evil is quite misleading. Because if we look at the early argument by Buddhism, and they talk about impermanence from four contexts. One is an empirical study, and the second is the principle, the context of they call it conditionality. And the third one is the context of dependent arising. And the fourth one dealing with the practical issue of suffering. So for Buddhism, there's nothing evil about impermanence itself. The problem is the people's attachment to permanence. And that's linked with the Buddhist idea of craving and greed. And which ultimately lead to they call suffering, dukkha, or dissatisfactoriness. So you see that even like within the Mahayana tradition, say Nagarjuna, try to argue that what the so-called the right attitude is neither, is philosophical, as you said, is very difficult to argue the very nature and how to overcome that. They just talk about neither permanence nor impermanence. But if you from the Zen perspective, the Chinese Zen will be something like just accept the flow, of life, accept permanence as just a reality of life. And I'm glad that you give the example like 4 different responses here in the Japanese context, and I can find very similar responses in the Chinese literature. But it doesn't mean those responses actually go along with the Buddhist one. I think Buddhists probably disagree with Buddhism would agree with none of the responses here. Particularly, I think Buddhism will not accept the concept of either transcendentalism or even say supernaturalism. It's really very weird to talk about Buddhism in that kind of concept. If you really want to use a concept, I think Buddhism would be much more easy go along with what called naturalism. Naturalism, better than transcendentalism or supernaturalism. But just my observation from the Buddhist viewpoint. But anyway, because I think that I still got the problem here because we do see that problem evil is understood in the West with a very specific context of theodicy. Is a question, a problem in trying to resolve the paradox situation in theodicy. And then when you try to transmit that concept in the Eastern tradition, probably you have to redefine the concept of evil here. What is evil? Or no? What kind of evil you talk about here? This is kind of it's kind of an ontological issue, or it is kind of issue about perception, or it's issue about what? Probably we have to define that concept. Okay, that's my first question, or maybe my comments. My second one is also linked with this question about evil. Japan and Japanese culture is quite well known in the world for its ghost story. There are so many horror movies. I'm a horror movie lover. So I love Japanese horror movies. And a lot of ghost story here in Japanese context, also dealing with the so-called evil spirit. But very often evil spirit here in the Japanese context is linked with this notion of uncleanness, or unclean spirit. And vis-a-vis in the Western tradition, you talk about haunted house or ghosts, which has a lot to do with again, this notion of like demon, antichrist, or some sort of Lucifer, whatever, is again linked with the Western notion of evil. So again, and behind that is the whole idea about the defilement and about people's sinfulness, the burden of guilt, and so on and so forth. But that will not be the same situation in Japan. I just wonder if you agree with my observation or not. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, a lot of very interesting points. Regarding the first comment, yeah, so you might say that it's not appropriate to call the problem of impermanence as a version of the problem of evil, because there is no such concept as evil in Buddhism. You might say that evil is a very Western concept. The problem of evil is very easy to formulate as an objection to Western theism, because evil is a contrasting concept of God versus evil. Yeah. And maybe we don't have that kind of structure in the Eastern tradition. So yeah, I share your worry that it might not be right to consider it as a version of the problem of evil, even though structurally speaking, it's quite similar to the problem of evil. And another point about naturalism. So I think you said that transcendentalism, according to Buddhism, is not supernaturalism, because Buddhism doesn't require supernaturalism. And I mean, it's kind of related to your second point, but actually I would want to ask you as an expert about this, because for me, I'm not a Buddhist scholar, so I'm not an expert on this, but it looks like in Buddhism there are a lot of supernatural entities. So coming from Japan, I see all sorts of spirits and supernatural beings. Many of them are derived from Hinduism and also indigenous traditions. But often it seems to me that often Western thinkers think that Buddhism is kind of, especially among analytic philosophers, there's this idea that Buddhism is a very, how can I say, Buddhism is a kind of religion that is very much compatible with our naturalistic scientific worldview, because it doesn't require supernaturalism like Christianity or Judaism or Hinduism. But my friend Kelly James Clark says that actually that's not it's kind of an ideological claim, because if you look at Buddhism closely, there are all kinds of supernaturalist beliefs. And as you were saying, if you go to Japanese Buddhist temples and other places, you can find all kinds of supernatural beings. So I was wondering about your claim that Buddhism is Buddhism doesn't require supernaturalism. Yeah.
It's a very good question, very complex. Buddhism itself is very complex. I'm a Buddhist philosopher, not one who studies religion, but I do see there's a big gap between religious practice by common people and Buddhist philosophy, particularly in the Mahayana tradition. You see more and more like an image of the supernatural things. And in terms of a Buddhist practice, yeah, you do see that. I think that's a lot to do with how Buddhism adopt the local folk tradition. Like in China, they talk about Taoist worship, which Taoism like Shinto in Japan, a lot of kami, and in Taoism a lot of other spirits. So we see that more and more, like particularly in Mahayana tradition, they develop a lot of so-called supernatural entities. But if you taught really from the Buddhist philosophy because they really follow this, they call causality, because causality cannot transmit it from something natural to supernatural. And also it's very difficult Buddhism accept something which is really like a God figure, because this notion of causality, dependent arising. So in that sense, but if you ask the Buddhist monk, they say, okay, a lot of deities to be worshipped by people just a skillful means, they are empty in the end. So they are not that have very strong, and in a sense, like philosophical, is very difficult to argue for supernaturalism in Buddhism. That's just my observation. But again, at the practical level, people do worship, so I cannot say they don't have that.
Okay. I mean, it's strange that I'm asking you a question, but the question that I had was that, so you mentioned that none of the 4 responses are really Buddhist. And I was thinking, for example, Hermetism, whether or not it's a successful response to the problem of impermanence itself, isn't it very much?
Because in the Chinese context, Hermetism is the question is in comparison with so-called being engaged and not engaged. And that became really a perennial question in Chinese tradition. And in Taoist tradition, there's a huge, tradition, they call hermit tradition in Taoism, refer to those people who are, first of all, politically disenchanted with the situation. They try to avoid any political involvement. And secondly, because the cultivation, so-called immortality, they want to be in a kind of like a more like a natural, non-human situation that they can cultivate their qi energy. So something like that. And Buddhism itself, Buddhism is, in a sense, in China is more non-attached in the first place. So they don't really emphasize, you don't need another kind of disengagement anyway. So they are already disengaged because they are not involved directly with any kind of political or secular things like Confucian, did. So in that sense, in China at least, Hermism is always linked with the Taoist tradition rather than with the Buddhist.
Okay, because I assume that Hermetism is very much Buddhist, because the main idea is to get rid of worldly attachments by living in isolation.
Right. From outside, you can use the term, but the Buddhists themselves seldom use that term to say, oh, we are Buddhist hermit. At least in the Chinese context, no, they're always Taoist hermit, not Buddhist hermit.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful.
Victoria, the question.
Yes, thank you, Yujin. I really liked this idea of the problem of expectations mismatch. But I wanted to sort of press on your idea that that the problem of pain and suffering and the problem of impermanence are actually 2 independent versions of the problem. So if we ask, why is impermanence a problem, then it seems that the natural answer to that would be to say, well, impermanence is a problem precisely because it causes suffering. But if that's the case, then these 2 problems that you're trying to keep apart come together. So I'd be interested to hear your response to that.
Yeah, so yeah, it's quite tricky because impermanence can be used to emphasize pain and suffering as well. So when someone suddenly dies, that's very painful. So here there is both impermanence and pain at the same time. But I want to argue that pain or suffering are not always necessary for impermanence, and that's why there are distinct problems. And the problem of impermanence is, the core of the problem is about our conflict between our assumption that everything will go on forever and the reality that things can suddenly end. And the thing that can suddenly end can be pleasure and joy, or pain and suffering. And this end doesn't necessarily have to involve pain or suffering. So we don't necessarily need to suffer because of the end. So in that sense, I claim that there are two distinct problems. But again, it's quite difficult to clearly distinguish them, because in some cases, both of them are involved.
Hmm. Okay, and I have a second question, if I may.
Yes, yes, sure.
So if I'm right, the basic fundamental structure of the argument is that the problem of impermanence requires positing something permanent.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're looking for something permanent, following the general Buddhist thinking, it's got to be something which is non-natural.
Mm-hmm.
So for that reason, what you're calling the supernaturalist response is going to be the best one.
Mm-hmm.
So is that?
Yeah, I think that's roughly right. I think Buddhism is a little bit tricky, because Buddhism doesn't postulate something permanent. So there's this, what Ellen was discussing as well, whether Buddhism really requires supernaturalism when it doesn't postulate anything permanent. So maybe it's easier to understand it by setting aside Buddhism and focus on Hinduism or Christianity, maybe. So yeah, the truly satisfactory or satisfying response to the problem of impermanence has to postulate something permanent, and something permanent has to be beyond our impermanent reality.
Yeah, I think you're right that the Hindu case is the stronger one. It's really interesting. So thank you.
Thank you.
I also have a question. There is no other. Okay. Now my question is actually related to Victoria's previous questions. I was very much impressed to learn about Hojoki's writing that really reminds us of Voltaire's Candide. It's so striking, right? This similarity. So yes, I was thinking of this problem of expectation mismatch, and from there, I was just role playing, right? So I would be surprised. So I would have a problem of expectation mismatch if I think that there is a God, or there is some kind of a permanent entity that has a design on my life, on the world. But I say, if I put myself in the shoes of a naturalist, of someone that takes the world to be just, impermanent, unmutable, unchangeable, and everything in it is perishable, I would not be surprised. I would not experience any kind of expectation mismatch. So I was wondering whether the argument that you have designed is actually addressing the metaphysical problem rather than the emotional, psychological, or existential problem of this mismatch of impermanence. And if that is the case, the responses of impermanence that you have presented in their shortfalls, I mean, this would be responses to the existential level of the problem. Although individuals may not be surprised, so they would not experience any mismatch of expectation. They still will have to deal with it, right? So they are not in that way solving a problem, just coping with what they take to be the reality. Whereas this idea that the only solution to the problem of impermanence is just the assumption of some impermanent level of being what there is, that would be a solution to the metaphysical problem, right? I mean, in a way, the only way to, that would be, again, a solution at this existential and psychological level. But metaphysically speaking, once you have assumed the existence of some kind of transcendent being, then you have to address the problem of what kind of being that is. What's the nature of that being? Is that a perfect being? Is that a good being? And if that, and then depending on the way in which you answer this question, you will still have this, problem of impermanence popping up, or problems of the evil popping up. So that was my impression, but I'm not a philosopher of religion. That was just my ideas while I was listening to your talk.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you raised some interesting points. So the expectation mismatch can arise differently for different people. So if I'm a theist and I believe firmly that the world was created by God, and if someone shows that actually God doesn't exist, then I'll be astonished. But if you are a naturalist, then your expectation is that the world was not created by God. So if someone shows that God doesn't exist, then you wouldn't be surprised. So there are different expectations for different worldviews, and so sometimes this kind of problem arises for some people, but not others. And in relation to your second point, now I try to remember what you were saying towards the end.
So then once we solve the problem of impermanence by positing permanence, then
right.
What kind of, yeah.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so there is this expectation mismatch, and we try to fill this gap by postulating something permanent, and that might address the existential problem. So now we feel better because now we can believe that ultimately there is something permanent, but there is a further metaphysical question about what is this permanent thing. So, Christians might say this is some kind of supernatural God, but maybe in the Hindu tradition, you don't necessarily postulate this kind of God as a personal being. And yeah, so that's a further metaphysical question that transcendentalists have to address. So just by pursuing transcendentalism, I mean, they do resolve the problem of impermanence in one sense, but there are, this view will raise further questions about exactly what kind of permanence or transcendence we should assume.
Yes. Okay. I think, unfortunately, oh no, we still have a 1 minute if there is one more question. Oh, there is one question in the chat. Sorry, I missed it. Well, it's a long question. So it's about Eliot and Ezra Pound. They believe Shakespeare's works are great because they are universal and impersonal, and they use different methods to present the timeless and permanent value in their poetry. For example, just opposing disparate images and symbols from different cultures and time periods together. So my first question is, do you think it's kind of permanent transcendentalism in their poetry? And my second question is, how do writers in Japan address the problem of impermanence in prose novels and poetry?
Prose novels and poetry. Yeah, so I'm not an expert on poetry, so I don't even know if my interpretations are correct, but I try to extract these philosophical views that are underlying the poetry. And yeah, as you say, sometimes this poetry or novels, they are more vivid than philosophical papers to illustrate the problem of impermanence. So sometimes it's very powerful. I mean, analytic philosophers, they don't normally like this kind of claim, but I think sometimes artwork or poetry can be more vivid, especially when we address this kind of existential problem like pain and suffering or impermanence. So it's very helpful to, I think, discuss literature in this context. But I'm not really familiar with relevant poems by T.S. Eliot or Hound. But yeah, I'll copy and save this comment. I'll do more research. But thank you. It's interesting to know that there are some similarities in poetry in the West. So thank you.
Now, yes, now we run out of time. And thank you, Professor, for this wonderful talk and for having accepted our invitations. And actually, we are hoping, we're looking forward to having you here in Macau, maybe in the near future. So
Yeah, that'd be
thank
very
you.
nice. I have never been there, so I would
Yeah, would be
to
great.
and meeting
So
you.
thank you, and have a nice day
Thank
ahead.
you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.